Welcome, everyone, to the One Business World conference on Thursday. And I'm here to introduce Beth Banks Cohn. And she is an organizational change consultant and senior executive coach with over 25 years of success in the healthcare, pharma, bio, IT, high-tech, retail, engineering, and manufacturing industries. She's regarded by many as an authority on culture, leadership, and change. Beth is a sought-after speaker on executing organizational change initiatives that stick. She applies her cognitive transformation expertise to a variety of business initiatives, including corporate culture, organizational design, M&A, cultural due diligence, communication, and training. My name is Lee Mozina. I'm in Seattle, and I do diversity, equity, and inclusion training and communications. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Beth. And I would love to hear you talk to us about your change success model.
Thank you so much, Lee. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so hi, everybody. I'm so excited to talk with you today about the role that our three parts of the mind play in successful transformational change. So why three minds, and where does that idea come from? I always want to give credit to my colleague and mentor, Kathy Kolbe. Kathy is the founder of Kolbe Corporation and the Kolbe A Index, which is the only tool available today that measures how we instinctively take action when we're motivated to solve a problem. Kathy Kolbe introduced me to the three parts of the mind years ago, and it has become a critical part of how I help organizations create successful and sustainable change. So, what are the three parts of the mind? Sorry. Okay, so here they are. Two of these are very familiar to us, right? The cognitive or thinking part of the mind, and affective or feeling part of the mind. So let's go over those quickly, and then we'll get to the third part of the mind, which is probably not as familiar to us. And the cognitive or thinking part of the mind is where we have our IQ, our skills, our reason, knowledge, experience, and education. And the affective part of the mind is where our desires, motivations, attitudes, preferences, emotions, and values are. And then we have this third part of the mind, and it's a part of the mind that we've known about for a really long time because Aristotle wrote about it. So it's been around for a while, but it's not really been included in conversations that we have about the brain or the mind. And that's the conative or the doing part of the mind. So conative is defined as simply action derived from instinct. And it is when we are motivated, how we take action without even thinking about it. So it's where our instincts are, our drive, our necessity, things we're driven to do or that we can't do things in any other way. It's also where our natural talents are and our mental energy. And mental energy is important, and we'll talk about it more later when I talk about change fatigue. And one last thing, so you'll notice between all of the parts of the mind, there's arrows because all three parts of the mind work together and no part can work independently from the other. For example, we take action when we're motivated to solve a problem. Motivation is an affect, right? It's from the feeling part of our mind. And so that's where we see how the three parts of the mind work together, because how we take that action can change over time based on our knowledge, our experience, and our education. So let's talk about each one of these as it relates to change and how I use this to help organizations think about and plan for successful changes. So let's start with the cognitive part of the mind. So the cognitive part seems easy, right? Knowledge, skills, and education. And we used to say, oh, we just have to tell people about the change and then we have to train them about it. And then that's it. But so it seems easy on the surface, but it really isn't. And that's because it isn't enough and probably was never enough. But today, for sure, it isn't enough for us to just tell people about the change. We need them to really come to the same conclusions that we came to when we were making the decisions. So it's really important to realize that even if an individual doesn't agree with it, it's important for them to understand and come to their own conclusions around whether this change is necessary or not. And it's not so passive, right? So we hire smart people and they come to our companies and use those smarts every day as they pursue their work, if we're lucky. And when it comes to change, telling them is too passive. We need them to really, like I said, think for themselves. Give them the background, give them the reasoning behind making the change so that they can come to the same conclusions that we came to when we were deciding to implement something in the first place. And even if they don't agree with it, even if they look at it and say, okay, I understand what you're doing, but I don't agree with it. Even if they don't agree with it, they have a level of understanding where they say, okay, I'm on board because I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. We're going to go forward with this. So I recently worked with a company that was 2 years into a rollout of a transformational change, and it really hadn't gone very well. And the reason that I say go deep is because they actually ignored this part of the mind when they were making their plans. They did tell people, but they never thought for a minute that people needed to actually agree with what they were doing and come to the same conclusions. So they didn't go deep. And my recommendation to companies is always go deep. Really give people a background so that they can make the changes or make the decisions for themselves. So I recently worked for this company 2 years in, so much pushback about what they were doing. They basically ignored it, thinking that people would just over time get used to it and just work in that new world. And it was really a critical mistake and one that they pay for every day. And frankly, 2 years into it, it's almost impossible to fix it. And part of the reason that they really made this critical mistake was because they didn't answer sort of the why questions. Why are we doing this? Why is this important? Why did we choose this way and not that way? Like really, those why questions are important to be able to answer for people as you're going through change. So the bottom line is that you don't really get to check that box anymore for the cognitive by telling people that it's enough. And as you plan for the change, the key question that you have to ask yourself is, have we built the time and mechanisms to help people evaluate the change for themselves? That's the cognitive. So now let's talk about the affective. So the affective feeling part of our mind is where our motivations, our values, attitudes, preferences sit. And it's a part of the mind that companies actually do think about. Maybe not enough, but it is something that companies do think about. The most important aspect for planning for change when it comes to affect is, do people really believe in the change, in the need for it, in the way we're going about it, in the end goal that we have in mind? And I don't mean the kind of belief that's like the lip service kind of belief. I mean the kind of belief that you really need to have so that people will be making the sacrifices that they need for that change, because there will be sacrifice. And it may not even be apparent to those people who are making the decisions, but sacrifice will come into it. And people need to believe in a change enough to sacrifice for it when it comes to affect. So motivation, of course, is all behind this, because motivation is the key to action. And we're not going to take action if we're not motivated. And we're not going to take action if we're not believing in the change, because there are going to be things that we're going to have to do that aren't going to be so comfortable for us. I can't tell you the number of changes, large and transformational, or even small changes, where people needing to believe in the change has been dismissed. And those teams often focus on the cognitive, but they don't focus on the affective. And it may be because they feel it's too touchy-feely, or it's too or they're too technical and they don't quite get it. But these same teams get frustrated when the uptake, people following the process or working within the new world, is slower or lower than they expected or needed for the change to be successful. So as you plan for the change, the key question to ask is the change compelling enough at the individual level for me to make those sacrifices, for me to believe in it? Because if you don't capture the hearts, the minds don't matter, right? So you could have the cognitive part of it, the thinking part of it, but if you don't have the hearts or the affect, it's not going to make a difference in the long run. So that brings us to this third part of the mind, the conative, or the doing part of the mind. And employees need to have the mental energy required to participate in the change and make that required effort. So even if they're motivated to do that, if they don't have the mental energy, they won't be able to. And so we need them to be able to devote that time and energy to this. And if they don't have that mental energy, if they don't have that motivation that's going to lead them to action, none of it's going to happen. So when a change is often going not well, that's usually when I get called in anyway. If only they would call me at the beginning, that's what I say. But when a change isn't going well and I get a call, people often will ask me, is this a will issue or a skill issue? So skill is cognitive, right? And will is affective. And often it's neither. Often it's the mental energy or it's a drive issue, because conative is often the missing piece when change isn't going well, because it wasn't considered in the planning, even if the other two pieces were. And so if there's if the change involves people changing the way they work or the way they operate, so let's say they have the mental energy, they're motivated to make the change, but it goes against the way that they naturally work or they work best, and people become less productive and unhappier over time, and that really negatively impacts a change. We call it working against our grain. So when you're having to work against your grain, you know what this feels like. It feels like a slog fest. It feels like you are just literally grinding uphill, pushing that boulder. And when you're feeling like that, it's because there's something going on conatively that is not working for you and the way that you operate best. So I have a framework that I use for change called the Change Smart Framework. And in the strategize phase of it, we do extensive scenario planning so that we can uncover jobs or areas of the company where we're going to ask folks to work against their grain, either temporarily or permanently. And this is really critical to understanding why a change will or won't succeed. And I always tell folks, it's not that you're not going to do the change the way that you need to, but it's working against your grain isn't sustainable without careful thought and planning. And so it really is about the planning part of it and thinking about, how are we going to get around this? Can we do it differently so that it doesn't force people to work against their grain? But those are really important things to consider when you're planning. In addition, in the discover phase, I also have conversations about illuminating green lights and roadblocks. So a roadblock is often the amount, one roadblock is often the amount or level of change that has been put on an organization in the last 6 months to a year. So it's really important to think about the change in context, and because that has a direct effect to this conative or doing part of the mind. So I once worked with a company that so fundamentally changed certain jobs that the people in those jobs couldn't work. And they were asked to take action definitely against their grain, but in ways that literally paralyzed them. And to their credit, the leadership saw this really quickly, hadn't been thought about before. And they created a SWAT team with representatives from all the different levels to figure out what to do. And when they took into consideration people's instinctive action, then they found a solution and a way forward, and the problem was easily solved. So it can be done. I always like to do it before we get into that kind of situation, but it can be done even after the fact, as long as you're thinking about it. So when planning for change, the key question is, I forgot to talk about mental energy. So of course, we've talked about mental energy all the time, and people might be out of mental energy for lots of different reasons. And so it's always important when you're thinking about roadblocks and green lights that you're thinking about, where are people's mental energy? Often with the amount of change going on, but sometimes it's other things that have been going on in the company or in the world, like the pandemic. So the bottom line is that even if you have employees who agree that the change is necessary, they may not have the mental energy to really work for it. And if there's no mental energy, there's no change. So the questions to ask: how many other changes have been taking place? What else is going on in the world? And what kind of changes are you making at the individual level that could be a roadblock to their doing their work? So to quickly recap before we go on to change fatigue, at the cognitive level, employees have to be at that evaluation level. You can't just tell them, you have to give them the tools to evaluate and make the decision themselves. Key question: have we built the time and mechanisms to help people evaluate the change for themselves? From an affective perspective, then thinking about that employees must believe in an idea enough to sacrifice it, and that the change must motivate them to take the actions needed. And the key question is the change compelling enough at the individual level? And then at the conative or doing level, employees need to have the mental energy required to participate in the change and make the required effort. How many other changes are we in or in process of, or did we do already in the last 6 months? What else is going on in the world? Lots of different questions to ask about that. So let's talk about change fatigue. I'm going to talk about it in the same model that we have here: cognitive, affective, and conative. So it shows up differently in different ways, and it may be hitting people differently in different parts of the company. So you may have all three, you may just have one, and that's where the evaluation comes in, and the planning for it as well. So people are tired of change. I don't think that's news to anybody. And so the way that it might look from a cognitive perspective is that there'll be a lack of agreement amongst employees on either the need for change or the type of change that's needed. And then they might also be tired of seeing changes that don't make sense at their level. And you'll see that that's actually a theme all throughout. They may also react more overtly to changes that may make sense in the boardroom. Like I said, it makes sense at a high level, but doesn't make sense sort of farther down in the organization. And that's why really looking at and doing scenario planning down to the individual job level or job category level is really important when you're planning for a change. Affective change may come from employees who are honestly just too tired to care about the next big idea. Lots of reasons for that. It could be that they have too much going on in their personal lives. It could be that there's so much change going on in the company they don't know where to look first. It could be because they have still not recovered from the pandemic and all the effects. They just haven't been able to build up that affective or feeling part of their bodies. And these are not going to be able to tell you why the plan change doesn't excite them. They're just going to be sort of like flat from an affect perspective. They're just not going to see it as something that they're overly interested in, even if it makes sense to them. And then the last is the conative fatigue. Is employees are really being asked to work against their grain. That could be one thing, or their mental energy's been depleted and they don't have a chance to recharge, right? And so that could, again, be a work-related thing, or it could not be a work-related thing. It could be that they're in a job where they're having to use some of the way that they operate best, like too much, like there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. And it could also be that they have lacked the balance in the jobs themselves, so that they're out of balance in one area, focusing too much on one area and not enough on the other. And so maybe before the pandemic, we could have asked employees to work against their grain, and they might have been able to do it and figure out other ways to cope or manage with it. But it's not as possible. I mean, we have to sort of own the fact that we're still living in this post-pandemic world. So their affect and their lack of motivation from the affective fatigue, if they're effectively fatigued, really doesn't kick off their intuitive action. And so it all becomes like a very sad downward spiral. And it's a hard loop to fix, but it's really essential because even one area of fatigue makes it hard for a change to succeed. But if you plan for it, literally plan for it. Let's talk about change fatigue. What are we going to do in our project plan that will help us repair change fatigue, or help us mitigate change fatigue, or help people deal with it in some way so that we can succeed? Because taking into account building up those repair mechanisms into your change and your project plan can really support your ability to implement and sustain successful change. So you can see all three parts of the mind are essential to engage and take into consideration when planning for and executing all change, transformational or otherwise. When you take all three parts of the mind into consideration, both in planning, execution, and evaluation, you're really setting yourself up for sustainable success. And that's sort of my formal part of my presentation. So Lee, do we have any questions that came in?
Let me see. I have one question. hear from Lori Hefflinger. What are some practical ways to reduce or minimize change fatigue?
Yeah, so I think one of the things to be thinking about it from a 3 parts of the mind is sort of where's the fatigue coming from? Like, is it sort of too many changes? Is that the change fatigue? Is it that there have been changes that have done in the past? There's been a lot of sort of fits and starts, which could be affective people are just sort of tired of it, right? It could also be that that the way that changes are done in your organization have not been people friendly. So that, you have a change, the change is sort of meant to be for the betterment of the organization, but people at the lower levels pay for it. And so that's why there's change fatigue? So it really is looking at it from all 3 parts of the mind to say, which is it? Did we not tell them? Did we not make our case well enough? That from the cognitive perspective. So it's really taking in all 3 parts of the mind and really thinking about and having a conversation about identifying that change fatigue, and then sort of how can we mitigate that, right? So if you've had lots of fits and starts with change, to help people and say it out loud, we've had lots of starts with lots of fits and starts with change. This time it's going to be different because we're doing X, Y, and Z differently, and we're not going to be doing the kinds of things that we did before. Or we've realized that we have a lot of sort of lofty ideas, but we've realized that we're doing too much change. So we're going to stop some, and we're going to delay some, and we're only going to focus on this for now, and we'll move forward. So it really is taking into consideration and then making a different plan, and then really sharing that plan with people. Because I once worked with a group where it was 2 large divisions, and they brought them together. Then they wanted to take them apart. People didn't like coming together. They definitely didn't like coming apart. And the leadership had to stand up and say, listen, we made a mistake. Like, we thought bringing you together was the right thing, but it didn't turn out to be. So now we're going to bring you apart, and the way we're going to do it differently than we did putting you together, which was a bit of a disaster, is we're going to do these things differently. And so that's what we do. That's how you do it. Okay, I lost Lee. Okay, so I'm going to do this rest. So from Randy, does the type of resistance or fatigue that different employees exhibit usually relate more to their individual personalities or their relationship with that particular change? So resistance has a lot to do with a lot of things. So it has a lot to do with, it does have to do with personality, but it also has to do with their relationship to that change, right? So it is both, right? That's not like either or. It is both. Like and it's also sort of what people's experiences of change have been in the past. Like, one thing I say in one of the books that I wrote is, change handled badly is never over, ever, until you fix what went badly the first time, right? And so, and I tell leaders that, and they don't like that. So they're not happy about it, but it is true. And so it is all of those things. And it's also where you are in your life, right? One day a change may not move you at all, right? It might be, okay, I understand it, I agree with it, I'm motivated, I believe in it enough, and I'm it's not, cognitively, it's I'm motivated to take action, and I have the mental energy, and you're off to the races, right? But then something happens at home, or something happens with your job, and your mental energy is depleted, or you're emotionally drained. And then the next change hits you a completely different way. And so it's important as an organization to think about and plan about those things, but you can't control a lot of that. So you have to focus on what you can control from a planning and execution perspective, and realize that, yeah, there are going to be people along the way that aren't going to do as well. And you're going to need to figure out how to help them. But it's not something that you can plan down to the individual level. You really have to see where people are. And that's where what I say is middle managers are your key, right? Equip your middle managers with the tools to have the conversations needed, and your middle managers will be able to diagnose and figure out what they need to do with their people in order to help their people move through the change as effectively as possible.
So I want to highlight something you said that I think is so important. You talk about capturing the hearts. And it sounds like maybe the middle managers are like a bridge to, they have more information about the actual people and perhaps that process of capturing people's hearts. But related to that, and I just want to really emphasize this, I'm so grateful that you talked about the impact of the pandemic, because for people with a lot of resources and privilege, the pandemic is something they can afford to put behind them. But the reality is for lower level, lower income.
Okay, I hope that's not me. So I think what Lee was saying is the lower level employees are going to, they can't put it behind them. So it's important to keep it in the forefront of our minds, even if it's not affecting us as much as it did others. So let's go to Nancy. What are some methods for engaging employees in creating the change? So I would say there's a couple of different methods that I like. Of course, one is like actually talking to them, right? So using
Wow.
focus groups, using project teams, and really the method is figuring out ways to include people, having those conversations. On our first day, the first person that spoke, Kevin, talked about like all these things that you do, like create these teams of people where you talk about the change and you get their input and things. And that really, that's how you engage people, is by including them in the process. Then it's not being done to them. And you can do that. You can do that sort of using your middle managers to have these conversations and feed the information back up. You can just randomly choose people in the company and bring them together. And so there's lots of ways, but the goal is to include people. That's really the goal, is to include them in the conversation. So it's not so complicated, but it's complicated when you have organizations that don't want to do that. Like if you work in a command and control organization, or an organization that really focuses on the hierarchy, it's harder to do. It can be done. It's harder to do, but it's important. So Patrick asks, given your model, what are one or two key things executives can do better to actually lead change? So I would say the first thing is think about sort of that it's not just about the cognitive or the affective, that there's this third part of the mind. So expand your thinking into what goes into it. And I would say the other key thing that they can do is to take the time to actually do some of these things at the beginning. Like one of the things that executives ask me is, well, what can we do to streamline the process? Because we just want to go. And I'm like, well, if you go slow at the beginning, you can go really fast at the end. And a lot of executives don't want to do that because they equate motion with progress, and I equate motion with motion, right? It's just motion. So I think that's the other thing that they could do is to really think about sort of how can we like stop and think more about it so that we can go really fast at the end. And then Faye says, thank you so much, Beth. This has been incredibly useful. Is there ever a scenario where operative staff are so exhausted of change that going on in a company all levels that a change just can't be completed? Oh yeah. Yes, absolutely. And and the truth is that you would know that before, right? So that's the thing, is sometimes we're get into the change and we're like, oh, we're so surprised it's not going well. Really? Well, I'm never surprised. Like that's the thing, is like really being able to diagnose your organizations in a way that can help you say, this is not the right time. And I'm the last person to say, like, if you're not ready, you shouldn't go. Like sometimes you're never ready, right? And you should just go and figure out a way to mitigate the issues. But sometimes you just can't go. And you, as an organization, as a leader, the best thing that you can do is to say, you know what? This isn't like, if we do this in 6 months, it's not going to make or break us. And so getting out of this idea that everything is so important and you have to do it right now, like take a long-term view. So, because I do think that there are times when it's just going to be a disaster. And why would you, I mean, the cost from a people perspective, from an emotional perspective, from a monetary perspective, it's just not worth it. So I definitely think that that level of exhaustion exists, and you have to own up to it if it exists in your organization, and figure out ways that maybe you can fix that first. Or mitigate it so that it's not as much of an issue, so that you can move forward with the change. It can all be done, but you have to
Great.
be willing to have those tough conversations about it.
Okay. Take care, everyone. Thank you for coming. And by all means, reach out to Beth if you have any questions about this methodology. We'd love to hear more.
Thanks, Lee.
Thank you. Bye.